is the first of the 4 additional weapon styles. So the first thing I want to mention is this is not a comprehensive class on all one-handed fighting. It's an entirely different school of training. These 4 classes on different weapon styles are partly intended to be from the view of longsword, so that when you do mixed competitions, you have some idea of what to expect. The pieces of how the opponents are going to fight, the things they're going to do, so that you don't get shocked when you're fighting somebody in a weird style if you have never seen it before. You may or may not have in-club sparring, but hopefully, even if you have, this will give you a little bit more insight into what's going on. All right, so the first thing that's different is when we take our stance for longsword, we usually go back in like a 2-handed style, right? Well, when you're doing a one-handed, you don't stand this way. You reverse your feet and bring your strong hand forward. You'll typically always move forward with your front leg and back on your front leg to keep your sword forward. So you'll move this way and this way, not crossing into this and this, right? So the couple of reasons for this are, one, by keeping your strong side arm forward, you're keeping the greatest measure you can have at all times. So you're constantly just able to move on this rotation, keeping that reach.
All right.
The other thing is bringing your other shoulder back and actually aligning the body makes your body a smaller target so that there's less to hit, okay? So when you're this way, you're theoretically wider. Mm-hmm. So this way, I present a smaller profile, smaller targets for thrust, etc. That's also why a lot of times people will put like the hand on the hip in the back. This is to keep them from bringing their hands up. In saber and so forth, they'll do a thing where they do the hand on the neck. This is to protect against neck cuts, but then also if you were to bind the sword here, if the hand is here, it's quick access to hand, quick for grappling and engagement as well. So extra protection, extra here. The important thing is that you have some place, whether here or here, to keep your hand busy, because if you leave it loose, there's a tendency for you to bring your arm up like you're in a boxing stance, and then the arm gets hit. In any sort of tournament situation or whatever, it's still an arm shot. So why present something for them to strike? Because you could block successfully with the sword and still present like a shot across the arm because you kept your arm up here, just as a reflex for your face. Better to instead keep it behind the back, which brings your torso away and engages the weapon more, right? So, and you're going to move with this arm, but it'll typically be more of a rocking and less crossing step. You'll still have a full step and a like heel to heel step, the way you do with closing, right? And you'll have an open step where you're taking a full step, kind of like a crossing, as if you're stepping out. But you typically won't step with the back foot because that will shorten your shoulder. A very common thing with one-handed swordsmanship is the target of the forward arm, because you're presenting the rest of your body out, or like back to try and get away, because you're presenting this maximum reach. When you're engaging with swords, the arm shots are the easiest, most likely thing to hit. Now, when you do longsword, we still go for the arms and the hands. That's why we use jack chain rules to discourage that, to get more binding. But you don't have the leverage of 2 hands. You would still bind with a one-handed sword, but you're not going to have that sort of fulcrum mechanism of a 2-handed sword. In this case, it's like a one-handed / 2-handed sword. Yeah. You can do it with an arming sword, specifically the ones that I got. But it's going to be more about the placement of strong and weak than the use of 2 hands. So you'll try and use and displace, keeping that one hand in control. So it's far more likely in combat that you're getting out here that you displace and then go for an arm shot to try and hit that arm, cut back, and then retreat out. Okay. There's a couple of things that you do a little bit different. Ox, with a two-handed sword, it draws up pretty close, right? But again, this is my shoulder back. And in this position, with a one-handed sword, you can do something a little bit different in that you can bring an ox with a one-handed stance. You particularly see this from Nate. He likes this stance a lot. It's way further forward than it would be with a two-handed weapon.
Okay.
And it represents a defense from all downward strikes, right? You can defend that. And because of gravity, you can use it to add power into your swings, right?
Right.
So this stance is particularly good. They also like it for thrusting in. It creates a protection to your thrust.
All right.
One of the rules that we cover in an earlier lesson was always when you're defending thrust, that you always want to go into a hanging guard position because it defeats about 75% of the counters to a thrust. If you're starting in a hanging guard position and then you're thrusting in on it, that means you're already in that position to defeat most of those counters. So it makes it a really strong position for engaging, and it's one you really can't do in longsword. There's also a weak side ox. Now this is done two different ways. One is all the way over, but also I do it almost a center chest. You see my elbow is rested on my chest here. This represents sort of a thrust capability. It also allows a lot of point control. This will tire you out because you're holding the sword long term and extending something. Anything that you hold something out for a long period of time, you'll get tired. Well, this represents a point, but it actually gives you a lot of point control, and you're able to rest the elbow on the body, really relaxing yourself to adjust. So it's kind of a pokey position. Right. Less than a sort of a plow, because one-handed weapons tend to be shorter unless you're talking about the rapier. This doesn't really threaten at the face. So the plow, as a standard position, tends to be less effective than this because you can feel the difference of the presence of the point. Tracking? Okay. Like I can immediately feel that there's a threat here that I need to close on, and you can sort of thrust with it pretty easily. It's a pretty relaxed position. If you do it down here, it just feels safer for entry. Now, in the case of the fool's guard position, where you're trying to make your opponent feel safer and not give them a weapon to control, that's still true. But it just tends to be fool's guard and, you know, the like center chest ox sort of here, as opposed to sort of this, because this isn't quite as engaging or threatening, and it's neither the completely welcoming stance of a fool's guard to try and get you to come closer, right? So this or this. Some people will still stand in this position, but it'll tend to be more of an iron door where they extend it out a bit, because this presents enough of a point to actually feel threatening, right? If I'm trying to keep you back and be protected, so in one-handed swordsmanship, more iron door and less plow, because you feel that difference, right? Yeah. But this is more of your replacement for the plow. Okay. There's a couple other guards used that are for one-handed. So it's they have Italian names, but for the sake of this, I'm going to just do the overarm guard and underarm guard. So the overarm is basically like you're laying it on your shoulder, and you can lay it sort of flat so that it's one resting and you wouldn't be cutting into yourself at all. And the idea is, like, if you present your weapon forward, is that I go ahead and present it, then I can use this to knock the sword by dropping the elbow into a slam into that position. It's a good parrying, missed that, but it's a good parrying position. The same thing with the underarm, right? I can strike up with a parry that way. And you see that ends with a into that high hanging guard position as well. So it feeds like that. Kind of, yes. So instead of being pointed back at the ground, sort of the way you would do in tail, it could also be reminiscent of ki to some degree. But it's very much almost like crossing your arms, and it's a pretty rested position. Even if you're using one hand behind your back, you kind of rest it on your chest a little bit. This means that the weapon is not presented to be controlled in any way, shape, or form, and you have a strong displacement. So if my sword out there, you're able to strike that in, and then if you go into the hanging guard that we talked about earlier, well, but strike and then transition into the hanging guard, okay. And then not necessarily so high because you're going to go into a thrust.
Oh, right.
Okay, right? So strike, and then thrust in, and if I try and counter back, one, I'm having a measure issue, and two, any strike up at your arm is potentially defended by your guard. So those are good pairing. Now, so we have those. In this particular sword, we don't have one with a hilt. I need a longsword and a hilt. Either a small sword or a saber, either one, doesn't matter. So I'm going to give you a little bit into what to expect fighting a longsword. So I'll do the short sword demonstration and then we'll switch swords, so that you can get kind of a feel. I need a longsword too. Thank you. I should have known I need to. Thank you. All right, so I'll demonstrate with both of these.
All right.
So this has a sort of a pretty strong knuckle bow. It's almost a full-on hilt. If we're swinging at each other, I can do this catch here, where I drive my whole hand here. If you have a guard, there's a risk of going under. With these, you can really ram with the whole guard, and that's also true with the side sword, with these knuckle rings, right? You can catch with the sort of the quillins and the complex part of the guard, the finger rings. So these allow you to push in using the whole hand, and this also, because we're now at the very strong weapon, becomes a pure sort of strength engagement, more than your typical fighting. So if you strike down with your sword and then I catch it, I'm going to have a really strong displace with this. This allows a lot of in-position control and being able to go in. Now,
Gotcha.
You're currently using a one-handed sword. We're going to switch to a longsword for this real quick. If you're fighting a one-handed sword, you're in your plow, I'm in my one hand forward. Mm-hmm. The typical stance, I'm taking something like this or like this, and then I'm going to try and catch this, and then either attack you with a thrust, something along that lines, with that guard. Same thing with the saber. Moving in, you move forward to present. I catch with this, and then I'm trying to come back down with this, sort of punching into this guard. So you can do it when you have two one-handed. So down for a second. Okay. I'll give you this one. It's a little. This one because it's got a guard. All right. So again, we're fighting this way. I'm doing my point control. With saber, you tend to do more circular attacks. All right, so you're doing your circle attacks, and I'm looking in, point control, and then I charge and try and catch with this guard, push down, displace, and then I'm going for some sort of attack with a point. Right. So this idea of a punching guard, we do hit with the guard with the longsword, but because it's thinner and less complex and less likely to catch and hold in that sort of way that these guards do, you're less likely to kind of use it as a punching, like grabbing tool, because there's a greater room for error. There's so much metal, and with the finger rings and with these the quillins on the side and the knuckle bow, I can more safely charge this hand in and feel confident that my hand will be protected. So just to let you get a sense of that,
Okay.
If I'm coming at you with a long sword, I'm picking at range, and then you're going to push in with that position, right?
Okay.
Now, of course, then we could go into grappling or whatnot, but the thing I really want you to see is that that's your expectation. If you're fighting someone with a shorter weapon, they're going to need to try and get in closer. You've got a long sword, they're going to try and maintain a higher position for reach, and then going for the hands with those cuts. So you're going to have to watch that hand attack, and then also they're going to try and like catch the sword. So if I come down with this, you'll have the block and try and push in with that guard. So then I have to deal with that.
Right.
Now you're in grappling range. So not a bad instinct to go and grab for that sword. Also, if I did this, so you're with this block, I expect you to go in. I need to be able to stay back to use my reach. The advantage of a long sword over a one-handed sword is reach. So my tendency is to need to move back against a one-handed sword fighter to prevent you from having that reach, prevent you from grappling, prevent you from being able to get a strong displace of that, like punching on the guard on the sword. All right, so if I attack down and then you push, I need to release out of that, and then I can bring back in for a lower position to threaten with range, right? Constantly keeping that sword so that you can't lock down the long sword with the complex guards, and that I can keep you at the long measure. So fighting long sword versus one sword, staying in measure versus a charging in. If you're fighting with a one-handed sword, you're going to want to charge. You're going to want to try and catch and control, because your control with that guard will be strong, and you can do it largely safely. And you're going to want to continue to back up. This kind of creates like a scaredy cat look to a swordsman with a long sword fighting someone with a one-handed sword, because they're constantly moving back. There is a bit of an exception with the rapier, because the rapier's blade is actually as long as the long swords. It has the same catch mechanic with the guard, and it has just as long a blade, so you don't really have a superiority of reach. It's about point control versus the ability to displace. You're going to be able to parry significantly stronger with a long sword against a rapier. Any sort of parry displacement will hold and be stronger, but their ability to avoid being parried and held and move quickly out of that with point control will be fast. That's going to be your real competition, is your speed and ability to disengage better than my ability to parry and lock down your weapon with a strong line of defense. And am I able to maintain that line of defense through efficiency of movement to prevent you from moving that blade around and thrusting back on me? At the same time, they're going to go for that knuckle bow punch on the weak of the blade to try and displace mine once my sword is presented out long enough. So that's the general concept of one-handed swords and of one-handed swords versus long swords, if that makes good sense.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Well, I don't know, I can talk about fighting, but
we can, but we can also spar one-handed versus long sword and one-handed versus one-handed after this. Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm still light, so it's only gonna be like light sparring though.